This is a quick look at Fanthorpe's Rising Damp poem. Now, this video assumes that you've got a copy of the poem and that you've read it through and had your own ideas about it. So all I'm doing is picking up some thoughts and some prompts that you might find useful for a close reading at this point. So looking first of all at our title, I'd look at the different connotations of this, because if you do a quick Google, then rising damp will show you that it's the bane of certain properties. It's the term we use for a kind of rot issue where wet gets into a building. Maybe the damp-proof course or so has failed, but it's that kind of idea that the damp gets in, and once it's in, it kind of works its way up the walls, and it leads to that kind of rot and decay. So first of all, you've got the idea of that as a kind of domestic or a kind of building issue. And you can extrapolate from that the idea that it takes the foundation of where you live or something that mankind has constructed, and it starts to eat away at it. So you've got that kind of inherent growing problem that's very difficult to eradicate. And the more you read about the poem, the more you'll realise that actually Fanthorpe, she's chosen a very appropriate title. The other thing, obviously, you have is, if you take it at face value, the idea that damp is something wet and it is rising. You can look at that kind of literally going up. You can look at it in terms of the present participle, that it's a continuous action. And you can look at it kind of metaphorically in terms of rising, to resurge, to come back to prominence. Think of Maya Angelou, still I rise. That idea of kind of not being able to be kept down, still in the ascendance. We then have the epigraph, and I'd suggest that you always go back to the epigraph and kind of revisit it once you've worked through this video and had your own thoughts. Because yes, factually we get this comment that, you can divert a river, but it's very difficult to get rid of it altogether. It's worth thinking about that again once you've looked all the way through the poem and we've considered the implications of the final stanza and that final list of those classical rivers. So just some thoughts as we're going through it, really. I picked up that, at our feet they lie low. So straight away you've got that opposition in the personal pronouns. It's our feet, collectively they are separate, right? So we've got these two entities, an us and them situation. And lie low can be kind of construed literally in terms of low lying. They have gone under the surface of the city, but also that they are, metaphorically lying in wait. There is some element of subterfuge there we can think about. The little fervent underground rivers of London. Now, if you take fervent, you've got the meanings of, passionate and intense, but also hot and burning. And again, hold that thought to the end of the poem. And I think the minute you get London and underground, then your expectations are, of the tube. So you've got this idea of kind of a man-made network alluded to, but actually this is an entirely different underground network. This is the kind of burning, passionate little rivers of London. And that idea of putting, the placement on its own line really emphasises the subject of the poem, kind of the feeling of announcement. And that leads into this italicised recitation, almost I've put down here, like it becomes an incantation, that idea of a chant or some sort of recital of the kind of tributaries of London. And these are little rivers, little kind of tributaries to the Thames or so, which have disappeared as London has developed and become the kind of sprawling metropolis it is. If you're interested, and this is a complete aside, it's a really good series of books called The Rivers of London by Ben Aranovich, and it is a kind of fantasy detective series where it's kind of in part based on real life London, in part based on this weird fantasy London, where all these disappeared rivers are actually now manifested as people walking around, and they've all got weird, strange powers. If you like Neil Gaiman and that kind of fantasy, they're well worth a look. They're actually very good. There's about 5 or 6 of them now. Anyway, back to the poem. we have these things whose names are disfigured, frayed, effaced. So that triple, the cumulative effect of destruction, of eradication, but we've also got that connection with Dis being Hades, again holding that classical thing in your head, coming down to kind of think, well, if you are figured by Dis, you know, what have you been created by or created for? If you are effaced, you are kind of erased or made inconspicuous, so you know these are eradicated. Frayed is kind of broken, frazzled, kind of worn out almost. And I think it becomes kind of notable that it says the names are disfigured, frayed, effaced. So their names have kind of faded, and yet, you know, we know from the epigraph that these rivers are still there. So you know, what are they and what are they doing? Now, these are the Magogs. So this particular thing, I should have put the asterisk in. Giants, okay, old British legend, do again a little bit of Googling, but basically old giants, either depending on which legend you look at, one giant called Magog or two giants called Gog and Magog, but basically kind of taken prisoner, made to serve the English king, worked as kind of porters and security basically for the royal castle. But, you know, this idea of kind of powerful beasts that have been made subservient to the state, right? So these old giants that chewed the clay to the basin that London nestles in. So we have London with a very kind of familiar, comforting verb, nestles. The fact it's, you know, cradled, it's looked after, it's snugly in there. Basin is both geographical and almost claustrophobic. The idea that, you know, you're kind of in a scoop of something. But chewing the clay, I mean, obviously, if we look at what that image is meant to evoke, you've got the idea of erosion, I suppose, London being in a basin and these rivers having helped carve out that basin. You've got the idea of consumption coming from chewed, you know, that you know, London has been eaten through. And clay, earth, but also clay with all of its kind of biblical reference in terms of the body. You know, Adam being made out of clay, etc. So generally, these are the giants that have created London, that have kind of, you know, worn this hole in which London sits. These are the currents that chiselled the city. And again, you know, current, this force, this power, and chiselled it in terms of manufacturing, you know, that struck away at, wore away at. And then that turns into most kind of the image of the domestic or the kind of industrial powering the city, kind of almost domestic, industrial and spiritual. You know, you've got washing clothes, turning mills, children drink, salmon swim, wells were holy. It kind of covers all aspects of life. So we can see that these rivers are pervasive, you know, they're kind of everywhere in their influence. But they have gone under, right? If you think literally to go under, you know, they have been subsumed into the earth, they've gone down. They no longer flow on the surface, but also to go under, to, you know, kind of collapse, to kind of be defeated, to be lost, to be unsuccessful. Boxed like the magician's assistant. And I say with that simile, you know, the magician's assistant, it's a trick, it's an illusion. You know, you have to think, you know, what is actually happening to the magician's assistant? Well, nothing that you think is happening is true. So, you know, boxed away to come back out again. Buried alive in earth. So again, kind of escapology, or, you know, kind of the impossible survival trick. And then forgotten like the dead. You know, that is not a common idea. Normally it's remembered like the dead. So, you know, this is kind of subverting our expectations slightly. You know, are the dead forgotten? And I just thought I'd pick up on the buried and boxed, the kind of plosives there starting each line, to have the force to them. And as I say, I'm suspicious of that simile, you know, forgotten like the dead. So they return spectrally. A spectre is a ghost, right? So they return in kind of ghost form after heavy rain, confounding suburban gardens. So that confounding to mean surprise or confuse. And so, they come back, and the confusion is physical, the confusion is kind of metaphorical in terms of what it does. Confounding also to mean to mix up. These rivers rise again, that idea of rising we talked about, and cause chaos in terms of floods. They infiltrate, and I think that this is a really interesting example of kind of enjambment and the line break, because the whole sentence is they infiltrate chronic bronchitis statistics, but by leaving that they infiltrate on that end of that line, it becomes a statement itself, the idea of they get everywhere, they sneak in. There's that concept of subterfuge, espionage, to infiltrate something, to worm your way into it. And chronic long-term bronchitis statistics. So, these rivers are causing this damp, this rising damp, to go back to the title, which is causing people long-term lung diseases and counting. This is the effect that these rivers are having. There is pervasive damp in London. It is these rivers. And then a silken slur haunts dwellings by shrouded watercourses. So this silken, this smooth, but slur, elision, eliding together, kind of blending together, but also insulting, also kind of saying awful things about. Haunts connects to our spectrally, so we've got a growing metaphor in terms of these rivers are being portrayed as spectres, as ghosts, as haunting London. Again, picked up by the shrouded watercourses. Watercourses, a shroud is like that funeral burial cloth, and to shroud something is to hide it from view. So, to unpick that whole image, it's really lovely. It's got that idea of the insult to London, the mixing up, the blending through, which would be caused by a flood. The kind of blurring together of everything. The fact that it can't be got rid of, but it also can't be kind of identified as something tangible through the haunting. The funereal imagery around shrouding, and after all of that, you've still got the kind of sibilance through it. And shrouded watercourses, these are buried watercourses, these are buried waterways. And the idea of is taken for the footing of the dead. Again, this is ambiguous. If you take something, you claim it, but also if you take something for something, you mistake it for. You kind of think it is something. So these kind of silken slurs are taken for the footing of the dead, the footing being the kind of foundation, the footing being the kind of secure foothold. So, the dead, these dead rivers, these dead that, are forgotten like the dead, aren't forgotten. They keep rising up, they keep kind of coming back and haunting the living city. And it moves on to the focus of saying being of our world. So, we are in the same space as they are, even though they may seem to be liminal. Okay, if you've got the word liminal, if you're not familiar with it, it means kind of borderline, on that kind of space between two states. So they are of the same kind of space as our living London, and therefore they will return, modal verb. And then that parenthesis, Westbourne caged at Sloane Square. So that river becomes almost a kind of victim of, I don't know, prone to that zoomorphism. He's been chained, been caged, echoing back to Gog and Magog, the giants kind of enslaved. And Sloane Square is such a common name for everybody, but this river is caged there and will jack from his box. So this escape will come out forcefully. And that blends the aspect of kind of threat and also kind of childhood, I suppose, kind of celebration or exuberance. A jack in the box springs out, surprises people. You don't expect it. And then again, more of this repetition of will, that modal verb, this will happen. There is an inevitability about it. They will return and they will deluge cellars, so they will flood the cellars. They will detonate manholes, so explode out through manholes, plant effluent, so plant kind of waste, the sewer system in our faces, we will get back what we have sent into them almost, and they will sink the city. Again, that kind of brutal sort of line there, largely monosyllabic, sink the city. It's almost like an order, an inevitability to it. And then we get the repetition of this kind of little chant there, almost that refrain, to pick up onto the next page, Wandle, Walbrook, Tyburn, Fleet. And then this change of focus, it is the other rivers that lie lower. Okay, so we've got London's network of lost literal rivers that are there. You can geographically explore, the story of London's rivers. But these other rivers lie lower. And again, picking up on that repeated ambiguity from earlier, the idea that, they are even further down and they are hiding out even more. And these rivers touch us only in dreams that never surface. So we've moved from a kind of geographical phenomenon to a more psychological, a more psychoanalytical realm, because there are worse rivers that we only see in dreams that will never surface. And the dreams will never surface and the rivers will never surface. So again, more ambiguity coming out there. What won't ever rise? But we collectively, so humanity collectively, feels their tug as a dowser's rod bends to the source below. So if you know anything about dowsing, it's that practice of some people believing that they can detect water using kind of rods, and the rods are usually, I think, made of willow or made of, I think some people use old coat hangers for it, and you hold these kind of two right angular shapes, and when you hold them very, very loosely, pointing straight ahead, and when the force of the water underneath the land pulls the rods together, the rods will cross, and that's where you dig for water. And it's meant to be a kind of ancient art of dowsing. Some people believe it, some people don't. But this poem is tying into that folklore tradition, that we feel the pull of these older, more sinister rivers underneath, just as that kind of near magical pull of the dowser's rod to the source of water below, or to whatever these rivers are generating below. And we get this final line, again italicized, of these 4 underworld rivers. So just to kind of give you that asterisk. The first is a river of fire from the underworld. Acheron is the river of woe. Leith is the one where you drink its waters and forget forever. And the Styx is the river to the underworld, across which the dead are ferried. So all of a sudden, these are a far more sinister set of rivers that we humanity are constantly being tugged towards. And the implication from this poem is that, the rising damp is not just the actual rivers and the personification of the actual rivers and what they're going to do, but also the influence of these much darker rivers on all of us, and the inevitability of that. So revisiting the epigraph with that in mind, you can divert them, but you can't get rid of them altogether. So I hope this has been useful. Have a think about it. Any other points you come up with, obviously kind of valid. I haven't been able to find an awful lot online about this. There's certainly one really not very good essay by a student that's been put up, which is largely public domain. But have your own thoughts about it as well, and see where you get to. Okay, bye now.